Hello everyone and welcome to yet another edition of the Focus Weekly. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. Now in just a matter of days, Finance Minister Professor Mthuli Ncube will be presenting his 2024 budget. What's to expect? What should he put in there? That will be the focus of our discussion today. I'm speaking to an economist on that and much more. Hello once again, and as mentioned, we are discussing the 2024 budget. I am joined by Dr. Professor Chitambara. Sir, great to have you on the show. Let's begin by looking at, obviously the focus now will be on what the projections and the wish list for the coming budget will be. But I want to take a step back and say, look, 2023 budget, when it was, presented a year ago, how have we fared in terms of what was put in that projection, in terms of expenditure, in terms of growth, amongst other things?
Well, obviously, a lot has happened. I think this year has been a very interesting year, a challenging year as well, owing to a number of factors, particularly to do with the election. We saw an increase, obviously, in public spending, electoral-related spending, whether directly related or even indirectly related. So there was a lot of pressure on public spending, and obviously, the initial budget was $4.5 trillion, but all indications actually show that we've way exceeded that. And obviously that also means our revenues have also increased. But I also understand that I think that the deficit for this year will be wider than the deficit for last year, largely on account of the elections and other expenditures related to that. Also, the chronic high inflation this year has been difficult with that. Of course, now, following the change in the methodology and approach in terms of measuring inflation, we've seen a bit of stability. Zimstat is now putting a greater weight, obviously, on USD transactions, and that helps to moderate. But in terms of Zim dollar inflation, we see prices continue to rise, largely on account of depreciation of the local currency, and that also obviously affects Zim dollar spending, even by government ministries and departments. So a lot I'm sure by the second half of the year, a lot of ministries had already exhausted their budgets owing to the chronic high inflationary environment, especially in Zimbabwe dollar terms.
Would it not have made sense then for us to see a supplementary budget presented by the minister?
I think definitely it would have made sense. The minister should have actually presented a supplementary budget when they presented the midterm fiscal policy review. Of course, that was not the case. But I think there will have to be some condonation of some sort, because it's quite clear that we have exceeded our budget for the initial 2023 national budget. So I think the minister should have presented a supplementary budget when he announced the midterm fiscal policy review.
Now let's look obviously at the one that is the focus now. All eyes on what we expect to see in terms of 2024. Government itself, in its preliminary papers, suggesting that GDP growth for next year will be about 5.2%. The deficit you talked about, they're saying it will be less than
for this year.
For this year, yes, 5.2%. Deficit less than 3%. Yeah. Are those realistic figures?
Well, I think in terms of growth, 5.2. I think that's fair. Of course, it's way above the projections from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the African Development Bank. But again, that's a slowdown, because last year we grew by about 6.5%. This year we are 5.2%. So it's not good enough. The World Bank is indicated that we need to be growing at least by between 10 and 15% from now until 2030, if we are to actualize the vision of becoming an upper middle income economy. So yes, it's fair enough when you compare with other countries, but given the structural challenges that we actually have as an economy, it's obviously not good enough.
We'll come back and talk about, obviously the 2030 target, the structural.
Then of course the deficit, 3% is still okay. It's way within the 5% target by SADC. So if we can achieve that, I think that should help to support macroeconomic stability and sustainability.
Okay. So when Professor Mthuli presents his budget in the coming days, what would you like to see in it?
Well, in terms of, there are a lot of things. When we look at the taxation arena, for example, I think the key story, even from interactions with not just the business sector, but other economic agents, the households, I think we need some tax relief measures. I think there's no doubt that Zimbabweans are among the most taxed citizens in the world. And in fact, the Minister of Finance himself has also acknowledged that fact. And he highlighted that he was going to relook the whole tax regime in an effort to not just simplify the regime, but also reduce the taxes so as to provide a bit of relief to economic agents, and also as a way of enhancing overall competitiveness within the economy. Because remember, tax is one of the key cost drivers in any economy. So obviously, the higher the tax, the more complex the tax, the less attractive, competitive, and the less attractive the economy actually becomes, not just to foreign investments, but also even to local investments. I always give the example of fuel. Our fuel is actually in SADC we are number 2 in terms of the cost of fuel. In Africa, we are in the top 3. I think we are number 3. And it's largely on account of the onerous levies, duties and taxes that we've actually imposed on fuel. So that makes us less competitive. So it leaves us with a huge productivity and competitiveness gap. Whereas if you are actually able to streamline taxes, reduce taxes, simplify that, you not just incentivize the businesses, but you also leave economic agents with more disposable incomes, which actually makes it possible for them to increase their demand, and ultimately the overall aggregate demand in the economy actually increases, which is actually good for even other indirect taxes like your value-added tax, which I think is the mainstay in terms of our tax revenues. I know, of course, some businesses have also been advocating for a reduction in the VAT to 14%. I think for me, 15% is okay. I know a number of countries that actually levy about 15%. So if you can leave the VAT at 15%, but at least adjust some direct taxes, and also streamline even the so many levies and other charges that we actually levy across the whole economy, I think that will go a long way in terms of enhancing competitiveness in our economy.
Dr. Chitambara, I know we have many more things to talk about on that wish list, but for now we need to stop here because we need to take a break. It is the Focus Weekly. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. We'll be back shortly. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Focus Weekly continues. Now, before we went to the break, you were talking about tax, perhaps the need for a relief for taxpayers because of the onerous burden. It's a conundrum for the finance minister because on one hand, he needs more revenue. And by reducing the tax burden, that reduces the amount of money he has. I suppose the idea is to widen or broaden the tax base without necessarily increasing the burden on people, taxpayers.
That's a good point, actually. Broadening the tax base, I think that's given the high levels of informality. But also someone can then also argue that one way of broadening the tax base, one way of ensuring that the informal gets taxed or gets formalized rather, is by actually reducing taxes. Because I know the World Bank has done studies which have actually shown that one of the key reasons why we have a huge informal economy, especially in the low-income countries, is because of the high levels of taxes, the high levels of compliance. So because businesses, so the small businesses, they find it more expensive to formalize. They would rather remain informal and actually underground. So for me, it's really a difficult balancing act to do. But when you look at even empirical evidence from countries like Ireland is a very good example. Ireland in the early 2000s, they actually came up with a low and uniform tax regime for direct taxes. I think they set the direct income taxes at about 15% for both individuals and corporates. And that was a good tonic that actually revitalized the Irish economy. And within 2 or 3 years, they were actually growing by double digits. At one time, the Irish economy was actually growing by 25%.
Wow.
Yeah, and they were also able to attract a lot of actually foreign direct investment inflows into the Irish economy. Even up to now, the Irish economy is one of the top performers within the European Union. It's really on account of those incentives, economic incentives, I would say, that they've actually come up with, including, obviously, tax incentives. But ultimately, economic agents respond to incentives. So if you want more production, you must provide the right kind of incentives, and taxes are a good incentive to incentivize businesses to invest more, and also even to incentivize foreign direct investment inflows into the economy. So yeah, it's really a tough act. I agree, but ultimately we must find ways and means of broadening that the productive base, the tax base, and tax reforms play a critical role in that endeavor.
Apart from tax, what else is it that you want to see?
The spending. I think we're not spending as much as we should on critical productivity enhancing sectors of our economy, like your education, your water, sanitation and hygiene, the wash sector, which explains why we are currently in a outbreak. Yeah. So I think my expectation is that we are going to see more public investments in those critical sectors. Because without wash investments, more public investments in wash, you can't sustainably address the cholera outbreak. Of course, the health, we've always underperformed in terms of our public spending on health, and we've had to rely on donors, on partners, and that's not sustainable. So I'm also expecting that the minister will increase public investments, public spending rather, on health, wash, even education and social protection again. Yeah, but again, we need to be very innovative in terms of how we because even once we implement tax reforms, I think it takes a bit of time again for the economy to begin to enjoy the benefits through enhanced aggregate demand and enhanced even GDP growth. So, but in the meantime, I think we need to be quite innovative, especially given the fact that we are literally on our own. And we have a huge debt stock of about $18 billion that we must pay back one way or the other.
Okay.
So of course, I know South Africa, they've actually introduced the National Health Insurance Scheme, which is actually being financed through what they're calling a sugar tax. They've actually imposed or are proposing to impose a 20% tax on sugar and sugary beverages. We've also seen countries in the Far East. The Philippines is a good example. The Vietnam is also a very good example. They've come up with universal health protection mechanisms, and they're funded largely through what they call corrective taxes. These are the sugar taxes, the salt taxes, the even taxes on environmentally unsustainable means of producing and consumption. But of course, when you talk about, again, it may seem like I'm being ironical in the sense that I'm saying let's reduce taxes, the direct taxes.
Yeah.
But let's also find ways and means of probably increasing indirect taxes, especially the corrective taxes that I'm referring to, and in line with regional and international good practices from other countries.
Okay.
So generally, I'm for lesser taxes, especially direct taxes, but I'm more amenable to adjust or increase taxes, say on cigarettes, on alcohol, especially given the huge burden that we also now have with respect to non-communicable diseases. So by taxing, for example, cigarettes, because that's a major risk factor for non-communicable diseases. So yeah, actually discouraging the consumption of cigarettes.
Also
we are also generating additional revenues. That's why I said I think we need to be a bit innovative in terms of how we mobilize actually resources, given the fact that we are literally on our own. So it's not going to be easy, I think. Yeah.
Indeed. On the expenditure front.
Again, on the expenditure front, I think there are a lot of opportunities, especially in terms of value for money audits across different spending by government. I think there's still a lot of wastages, a lot of non-productive spending, where we could actually leverage and harness and save actually critical resources that can also then be used to finance this critical productive spending. So there's still a lot of non-productive spending and too little productive spending on sectors that actually matter. But of course, for that to happen, you need the heavy doses of political will and commitment. Because you may also then have to look even the structure of government itself.
Yeah, may not lend itself.
And of course, these are reforms that may not happen in a year or
It's a process, as you quite rightly say.
The political economy of those kind of reforms, and also the vested interests, I think make those kind of reforms a bit difficult to implement.
Indeed. We need to take another short break. We'll come back and continue this discussion. It is the Focus Weekly. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Dr. Professor Chitambara, an economist, is my guest on the Focus Weekly today. Doc, I've not heard you talk about infrastructure expenditure. We've obviously done quite a bit of it in the past year, and opinions are divided over how we've gone about it and the problems that it may have created in other areas of the economy. But what's your view on how we should go about spending on infrastructure, and how much would you like to see spent in the coming year?
Infrastructure, again, that's an area where, yes, there's been improvements in the past. But when you look at how we are doing vis-a-vis good practices, so ideally, our economy should be spending about 9% of GDP on infrastructure. So currently, we are at about 5.7, 5.8, let's just say about 6%. So that actually leaves the economy with a huge infrastructure financing gap. That has actually been estimated by the African Development Bank a few years back at about $5 billion every year. So it means we need more public funding and investments on infrastructure. But again, how you finance it, it can create problems, especially if you're financing it through the creation of money, like what has actually been happening. So that could be problematic. Because in other economies, we've seen the private sector also coming on board through public-private partnerships. That has not been the case in Zimbabwe. But I think those are also opportunities and avenues that we could leverage given the right kind of regulatory environment and framework, and also the right kind of
incentives. Yeah. That's just
but like I said, it's a difficult and tough act for the Minister of Finance. Yes, we are celebrating that there's been improvements in infrastructure. The dams, we're seeing a lot of dams under construction, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Look at energy, for example. We're still experiencing rolling power cuts, and that's not good for doing business. So it means, yes, we have a lot of potential. I remember a few months ago, I was privileged to go to a place called Wonde Valley. So actually in Wonde Valley, what they're doing, they have their own power plant. The guy who owns the tea estates, he's actually established his own hydro, or mini hydro actually power plant, which is actually powering the whole of Wonde Valley. So even as we speak right now, there are no outages in Wonde Valley. So if we could replicate that in a lot of the areas where we have natural water bodies and waterfalls, that I think that could actually go a long way. But of course, businesses also need incentives again to embark on those kind of investments. But I'm happy that we're already seeing a greater uptake of green energy investments by private sector in Zimbabwe. And of course, that needs to be incentivized and encouraged even more.
Indeed. Let's talk about, you mentioned it earlier, the debt overhang, $18 billion. We've been in talks, negotiations, dialogues, all with a view to try and perhaps restructure this and find a way out of the woods. In this coming year, do you think that will make any, momentum, gain any momentum?
I think so because we have actually agreed on what needs to be done with. Remember, government has set up a high-level dialogue platform, which actually is bringing together the key partners, the creditors, the development agencies, even CSOs, and government itself. So they've actually, within that framework, they've actually agreed on a number of economic reforms, governance reforms, and institutional reforms that government must actually implement to unlock the full potential of the economy. And one of the key reforms under the macroeconomic cluster is the coming up with a staff monitored program with the National Monetary Fund. So I think we'll be seeing that probably next year. But in terms of actually getting like debt relief, that's obviously not going to happen. So we just have to grow our economy so that we are actually able to generate more revenues that we can actually use to defray the high debt. It's not an easy thing. We've seen countries, a lot of countries have actually received debt relief, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic era. We saw countries actually borrowing money from the IMF and the World Bank at 0% interest. That has not been the case in Zimbabwe.
Yeah. You mentioned the staff monitored program. It's not the first time we've done this. So
yes, isn't
it? What is the value? Why are we going down that route again?
So it's actually part of our engagement at a technical assistance level with the National Monetary Fund. So currently, we are not eligible to receive financial assistance from multilateral partners because of the debt, especially the arrears. So by undertaking a staff monitored program, we're actually demonstrating our commitment to implement the right kind of macroeconomic reforms that could actually unleash the full potential of our economy. Because with the debt, ultimately, it's really about ensuring that the economy is actually growing sustainably. For example, if we could get our economy to grow by at least 15%, like the World Bank has been telling us, means we are able to create revenues that we can easily use to pay back the debt here. So without, like I was saying, that without either debt relief or sustained growth, then it will be difficult to sustainably address the debt arrears.
Let's talk about that growth. We know that this year is going to be a bad or a poor agricultural season. We also know, or have been seeing, some of the commodity prices weakening on the global markets, and we rely a lot on mineral exports. We rely on the agricultural sector. Given these dynamics, growth projections, and
I think for next year it will definitely be lower than the projection for this year, because of those downside risks, especially on the weather front. The El Nino, and that will affect obviously even hydroelectricity generation. So I think next year is going to be tricky. That's why probably the minister is touting next year's budget on a pro-poor mantra, obviously because of the challenges that are going to arise on account of projected reduction or below normal agricultural production next year. So it really leaves us in a very difficult situation as a country, because if we are not growing sustainably, then even it's difficult for the poor men ultimately to benefit, but the poor man also benefits from high growth rate, and also growth rate that creates employment opportunities.
One final question, and very quickly before we run out of time. Some people have suggested that it doesn't make sense for the minister to continue denominating this budget in Zimbabwe dollars. We're running into hundreds of trillions of dollars. Why not just quote it in your...
And for me, that's also a political consideration, because once you denominate in USD, it's like you're actually admitting that you are a victim of chronic inflation. We know we are, but I'm not sure either politically it would be convenient to do that. But if I were the minister, I would probably denominate the budget in USD, but in terms of disbursements, use the interbank rate to make disbursements to actual ministries. That also helps in terms of ensuring the stability. Yeah, because like I'm saying that currently we are actually in a high inflationary mode in as far as the Zim dollar is concerned. And I foresee that situation probably continuing, especially given the exchange rate dynamics over the past few months. So if we were to make projections, I think we'll probably continue to see a depreciation of the local currency going forward. Of course, the extent may differ, but definitely there's going to be some depreciation, which will continue to induce Zim dollar inflation.
On that note, we must end the discussion, but only because we're out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Professor Chitambara. that does it for this edition of the Focus Weekly. Thank you so much for tuning in and for choosing us. Be sure to follow us and engage with us on our different social media platforms. The handles and platforms are on your screens right now. My name is Farai Makutuya. I'm back again next time. Be sure to join me then.